Are you for term limits on Congress and our state legislatures or against? Well, if you are like the overwhelming majority of Americans, you believe that even young political novices like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez should have a chance to bring some fresh new ideas to Congress and support enacting term limits now, and are saying that it's about time we had them. Of 45 total U.S. presidents to date, 17 were former governors, including, believe it or not, Thomas Jefferson. The rest were James Monroe from Virginia, Martin Van Buren from New York, James Polk from Tennessee, Andrew Johnson, who also served as Tennessee governor, as well as appointment to military governor of that state by President Lincoln. Rutherford B. Hayes, a two-time governor of Ohio in non-consecutive terms, Grover Cleveland of New York, William McKinley of Ohio, Theodore Roosevelt of New York, Woodrow Wilson of New Jersey, Franklin Roosevelt of New York, Ronald Reagan of California, Jimmy Carter of Georgia, Bill Clinton of Arkansas in non-consecutive terms, and George W. Bush of Texas. A total of 16 U.S. presidents were formerly U.S. senators, including James Monroe, who was also a governor, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, who was also a former governor, Benjamin Harrison, Warren G. Harding, Harry S. Truman, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard M. Nixon, and Barack Obama. So together, the former governors and former senators total 31 of the 45 former and present U.S. presidents, or 69%. And for those who favor having a profession of experienced politicians in rejection of term limits, have only to ask of these 31 presidents, which ones were actually great presidents because they were professional politicians. Maybe Jefferson, maybe Monroe, maybe Wilson, maybe both Roosevelts, maybe Kennedy, maybe Reagan. And depending on partisanship, you might even add Richard Nixon and LBJ, which brings us to just 10 of 45, or less than a quarter. It may not be that experience that put them on the list of greats, right? Barack Obama spent only one term as a senator, just one term, and depending upon partisanship, you might even be amongst those who would call him great. But again, it is highly doubtful that dipping his toe in the upper chamber of the Congress got him there because of experience gained, as much as a ticket punch, or as former appointed ambassador to Switzerland and President incumbent Congressman Don Beyer of Virginia, who aspires to be a senator, might say, check, federal experience. Applying the rules of construction that professional attorneys use to define ambiguity in statutes by looking first to the plain word meaning conveyed by the legislation, it can be argued persuasively that the Founding Fathers did not place much weight on experience as a requirement to run for Congress or even president. And one young former Army officer, Thomas O., just 25, set out in the midterms of 2018 to be an example of this minimum threshold, being a resident of his state and just 25 years old and 7 years a citizen. A senator under the Constitution need only have attained the age of 30 and have been 9 years a citizen. And if you think about it, that really could be just about anyone. That could be you. Moreover, if we took the argument of requirements for experience beyond what is written in Article 1 of the Constitution, the problem is that no one could ever be a first-term congressman or even senator lacking experience prior to perform that job. In fact, in the military, less than 2% of commissioned officers attain the rank of general-level officer, responsible in wartime for developing winning strategies for war. But the average officer spends less than 6 years in command position before pinning on a star. And most of their assignments throughout a 20-year career last no longer than 3 years, requiring them to continually learn their ins and outs of their present assignment. But they are not assigned to manage the day-to-day minutiae of a military unit, but to lead that unit on the macro level, looking at the big picture, while dedicated non-commissioned officers maintain the day-to-day and establish continuity. Congressman Don Beyer has stated that it is the same way with the Foreign Service, where he was appointed with no prior experience as an ambassador, and the U.S. Congress and its dedicated personal staffers and committee staff have years of professional experience and continuity for our elected members of Congress, and upon whom they rely every day, from everything from signing up for the lottery of office spaces at the beginning of a session to complex matters of national policy. So experience informs us that the determination of who is or who is not qualified for Congress is the judgment of the voters in a democratic republic. And most recent experience appears to confirm in Virginia's 8th Congressional District that you have a GoFundMe account campaign for Congress and create spicy noodle challenge videos for your campaign, the overwhelming majority of voters are probably not going to make sure that you win, but rather that you break the record low for vote tally percentage in the history of a challenger in your district. Oh, was that you? And historically, for those who bother to keep up with history and the latest developments in revision that appear in perhaps Time magazine, most credit the tradition of a 2-term executive to General George Washington, who had actually returned from retirement to become president, leaving Mount Vernon after having served once as a Justice of the Peace, a member of the House of Delegates, a delegate to the First and Second Continental Congresses, before being appointed the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army and later our nation's first president. And his noble former example began the mythology and legacy of an American Cincinnatus, in addition to the adopted acceptance that a president would only serve for just 2 terms, until Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose desire to continue service was directly responsible for term limits upon that office, in contravention to arguments by opponents of term limits who believe that if a person is able, they should hold a life monopoly on power. Well, most Americans do not believe that is so. And again, how many lifelong legislators are amongst the greats? Congressman Beyer is beginning his 3rd term after a record-breaking victory in vote percentage in 2018, over 76%, despite the fact that he has a 0% rating on national security. Called for a solidarity rally in a mosque most directly linked to the terror attacks on 9/11 immediately after the attacks against Americans in San Bernardino. And he even told reporters, after having served for a full term in Congress, that he had no idea what the bells ringing in the halls of Congress mean, which may well account for his having the worst roll call voting record in the Commonwealth of Virginia, despite being the envy of Congress, he claims, for living so close to his district. And we won't even get into how this global climate change expert believed that the deaths of over 7,000 Americans were attributed to global climate change. So what are the pros for term limits? Well, for starters, Virginia has already imposed term limits on the office of governor, the only state in the Union where a governor can only serve for 1 term. Still, it is not one of the 15 states that have adopted term limits for state legislatures, where representatives like Rip Sullivan evidently actually believe that you can rent an automobile without a driver's license, so you should be able to vote through a rental car loophole, or so he says. Or perhaps even Alfonso Lopez, who actually was required at a candidate forum to look down at his notes to recall that his own father was an undocumented immigrant and that fact caused him great shame, or so he told the audience. Just like Monique O'Grady, the Arlington School Board member, who had to read a prepared script to remind herself that she had been the victim of discrimination and felt pain just seeing the Washington Lee High School t-shirt that she just happened to have brought along to wave during the speech to change that name. But if you like this type of entertainment in place of responsible government, then perhaps you will reject term limits like the politicians who rely on you to return them 95% of the time to Congress every year, despite the fact that Congress, as an institution, has an approval rating worse than the president at 11%. But no one is trying to impeach their congressman, not even Congressman Don Beyer, who somehow grew his net worth from $11 million to $125 million in just 1 year, catapulting from the 15th wealthiest member of Congress to the second wealthiest among what is practically a club for rich boys. Even today, an entrenched institution that even the young Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York is rallying against in one of her 3 chambers of government and helping to force a term limit upon the speakership of Nancy Pelosi. And if these are our most educated voters, term limits is starting to sound like an even better idea every minute. And the fact is that it is estimated that over 80% of American voters actually approve of term limits. One poll finds that over 31% favor term limits, and an additional almost 47% strongly favor term limits, even if they re-elect their own legislators every year. Like in Dangerous Drivers, it is not us, but the other guy that is the problem. Even if in 2016, the Arlington police gave out over 35,000 traffic citations and over 19,000 to folks who just ignored a stop signal. Unbelievable, right? Moreover, some polls suggest that in the 15 states that have successfully enacted term limits on their legislatures, voter participation actually increased, even without making voting more convenient, like Delegate Rip Taylor believes we should do to increase voter participation. Yes, the rental car loophole guy, that same guy. And he's actually an attorney, believe it or not. Still, most agree that term limits will provide an opportunity for new talent to test their mettle and legislative leadership, providing even a progressive champion like former Nazi hunter Delegate Mark Levine to run for Congress, who currently says that he will only run for an open seat and never oppose the incumbent Congressman Don Beyer again. Not that he is frightened, of course, no more than Delegate Pat Hope for Virginia, who suddenly became silent about his claims that Beyer had stolen his election by purchasing car ads during the primary. Perhaps it was harmless because he is not complaining anymore. So, with all of the benefits of term limits available, who would or could stand in the way of such a great idea from coming to fruition, giving the state of Virginia the opportunity to join the 15 states that have enacted term limits on their state legislatures, and the 23 states of the 34 required to amend the Constitution to impose term limits on our elected representatives in Congress in Washington? Well, as you might imagine, just as George Washington recognized that slave owners were not going to give away their property in chattel slavery because it was the right thing to do, many career politicians do not want to lose their property in their job. So much for statesmanship. But also the big money lobbyists who enable a multimillionaire like Congressman Don Beyer to mount a $2 million campaign against an unknown with a GoFundMe account in the most reliable district in the Commonwealth are not interested in having to buy someone else to be their friend in Washington if they can keep the old hack in office. And even a progressive news publication like CNBC seems to agree with the assessment that term limits will actually begin to clean the swamp, forcing some of the long-term corrupt congressmen into a early retirement. So, if over 80% of Americans want term limits, if it will clean the swamp of corrupt politicians, if it will increase voter participation and it will give a new person a chance to serve his community and his nation, which is what our legislators are supposed to be doing. Why aren't you joining the movement to bring term limits to Virginia in our State House and for the nation in our Congress? Let's change Congress the easy way. Contact your legislators in Richmond and let them know that enough is enough, and it's about time. We need only a vote from our legislators in Richmond to join the states that have ratified the amendment to bring term limits to Congress, and Virginia would make number 24, with just 11 more states that would have to follow us. And Virginia always leads the way. Term limits now, because it's about time. So take the time to sign the petition to show that you want to make America great again. Term limits now, because it is about time. Non incautus futuri is the motto of Washington and Lee University, not unmindful of the future. My name is Major Mike Webb, and I am running for U.S. Congress. Next year, in Jerusalem, in liberty, with honor and excellence, the South shall rise again. Honest. Term limits now. Enough is enough, and it's about time. Honest. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.